opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 2255, the Federal Law Enforcement Officer Service Weapon Purchase Act of 2025, allows current and retired federal law enforcement officers to purchase retired service weapons issued by a federal agency to the officer at salvage value. Under this bill, the administrator of the GSA would be required to establish a program to allow current and retired law enforcement officers to purchase a retired firearm from the agency that issued that firearm to that officer. In order to be eligible to participate in the program, the officer must be in good standing with the agency they currently or formerly served. Any firearm sold through the program must be sold within 6 months of the date when the firearm was retired. Machine guns are excluded from the list of eligible firearms. Furthermore, the firearm must be sold at salvage value. Under current policy, federal agencies are required to destroy retired firearms by crushing, cutting, breaking, deforming each firearm to ensure that they are rendered completely inoperable and incapable of being used, except for the recovery of basic material. Additionally, destruction, quote, destruction of firearms must be performed by an entity authorized, end quote, by the head of the agency, and the destruction, quote, must be witnessed by 2 additional agency employees authorized by the agency head or designee. These actions all come at a cost to the American taxpayer. Taxpayers should not be forced to pay for the same firearm twice, first when it is originally purchased, and second, when it is needlessly destroyed. Not only would this legislation eliminate those unnecessary costs, but it would also recoup some taxpayer dollars from the initial purchase of that firearm. In 2022, the Fraternal Order of Police notified Congress that multiple federal law enforcement agencies were in the process of replacing their service weapons. These transitions accounted for the destruction of approximately 20,000 firearms, costing the taxpayer roughly $8 million. Allowing current and retired federal law enforcement officers to purchase such firearms would save millions of dollars to the American taxpayer. Last Congress, this legislation passed the House of Representatives with 232 votes, a bipartisan win. 13 Democrats voted in favor of this bill, including some that serve on this committee. This bill was never taken up by the Majority Leader Chuck Schumer for reasons that I do not know. But I want to remind my colleagues across the aisle that the last Congress, this bill was supported by leading law enforcement groups, including the National Fraternal Order of Police, the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, the National Association of Police Organizations, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation Agents Association, and Women in Law Enforcement. This bill is a priority for law enforcement, and Congress must do its part in supporting those who risk their lives for the safety of our citizens. This legislation not only saves American taxpayers millions of dollars every year, but also creates a system in which law enforcement officers in good standing can exercise their Second Amendment rights. I'm confident that more of my colleagues across the aisle will recognize this bill not as a partisan measure, but as a common sense, cost-saving initiative that supports law enforcement and the American taxpayers. Once this bill passes the House, I urge my Senate colleagues to put aside politics and send this bill to President Trump's desk and do what's right to ensure that it passes in both chambers. I urge support, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair will now recognize the ranking member for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Federal agencies are currently prohibited from selling functional or reparable firearms that are no longer needed. Under this regulation, when an agency no longer has a need for a firearm, it can either transfer it to another law enforcement entity or it can destroy it. This regulation helps ensure that federally owned firearms do not fall into the wrong hands, but it does miss an opportunity to save money by selling surplus firearms to the responsible law enforcement officers who use them. So in the 117th Congress, our former colleague, Congresswoman Val Demings from Orlando, who had been chief law enforcement officer there, introduced bipartisan legislation to allow a federal agency to sell at fair market value a surplus handgun to the officer who'd been using it on duty. Under the Demings bill, these sales would have required a background check, and it would have required that the proceeds from the sales would have been used for gun violence prevention and for gun safety training. Last Congress, Congressman Fry introduced a bill similar to the Demings proposal, but it wasn't bipartisan, it did not require a background check, and it did not provide any direction about what the funds resulting from the sales should actually be used for. Still, Democratic members of this committee felt it was reasonable, not as good as the Demings version, but they felt it was reasonable, and it passed out of the committee on a voice vote. If our colleagues had simply stuck with that version, I suspect it would be receiving broad support on the floor and might very well have been signed into law by now. But they instead chose to substantially dilute and change the bill again by adopting new amendments when it was brought to the floor. One amendment changed the sale price from fair market value to salvage value, effectively setting up the federal government and the citizens to subsidize private gun sales. Another amendment expanded the bill significantly by allowing surplus firearms to be sold not only to active federal law enforcement officers in good standing, but also to retired law enforcement officers. Because the Fry bill had also eliminated the background check requirement, this would create the remarkable situation in which it would be possible for an officer to retire, commit a crime that makes him or her ineligible to purchase and possess firearms, but then still be able to buy a firearm from the federal government without getting a background check. Agencies have no reason to track the behavior of their former law enforcement officers and are under no legal duty to do so, so they could unwittingly sell a surplus firearm to someone who cannot lawfully buy a gun. And all of this would occur without a background check that might otherwise prevent an illegal sale from happening. Another amendment expanded the types of guns that agencies could sell. Originally, the bill just applied to surplus handguns that the officers used, but it was amended to apply to any surplus firearm other than machine guns, including assault weapons, destructive devices like grenades, and even firearms that are subject to heightened restrictions under the National Firearms Act. Given that the bill had already removed the background check provision, these amendments would make it so that current and retired law enforcement officers would be able to buy an assault weapon, a grenade, or a National Firearms Act weapon from the government at a discount and without a background check, opening up a significant loophole suddenly in the background check system. We've come a long way from the original idea by Congresswoman Demings, Chief Demings. This led many Democrats to oppose the bill on final passage when it came up for a floor vote last Congress. All of these flawed amendments appear today in the version of the Fry bill that has now been recombined and all packed together. So in place of a reasonable bipartisan bill, Republicans are digging in on a proposal that opens up significant loopholes in our gun laws, turning it into Swiss cheese. It's disappointing that Republicans could not resist politicizing this traditionally bipartisan proposal that came originally from a Democrat. Because this bill creates unacceptable risks of a dangerous weapon being sold to a person who may not legally have one, I must oppose this legislation in its current form, and I urge all of our colleagues to read it carefully and to do the same. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report.
Amendment in the nature of a
Without
substitute.
objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered as base text for the purposes of amendment. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment just adds the year of the title of the bill. This amendment is not intended in any way to alter the substance or important purpose of this bill. And I yield back. Prior to doing that, though, I do seek unanimous consent to submit a letter to the record in support of the legislation, H.R. 2255, signed by the Association of State Criminal Investigative Agencies, the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, Major City Chiefs Association, Major County Sheriffs of America, the National Association of Police Organizations, the National Narcotics Officers Association Coalition, and the Sergeants Benevolent Association, NYPD.
Without objection, they'll be included in the record. Who seeks recognition? Gentlelady from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Once again, I associate myself with the comments of the ranking member. But Mr. Chairman, H.R. 2255, the Law Enforcement Service Weapon Purchase Act, misses an opportunity for a bipartisan bill and creates unacceptable loopholes in our gun laws. This bill would allow firearm sales to retired federal officers without a background check, One might think that those who have retired from federal law enforcement would be responsible individuals who can pass a background check, and undoubtedly, many of them are. But the bill creates an opportunity for someone to be employed as a federal law enforcement officer, retire, and then, perhaps years later, buy a gun from the federal government without a background check. The agency simply has no way to know what the person might have done in those intervening years. They could have become subject to a restraining order or addicted to illegal drugs, actions that would make it illegal for them to buy a gun, and it would make it so that they would fail a background check. But their former employing agency would have no way to know that. Our colleagues might point out that the bill does require that a retired officer be in good standing in order to buy a gun under this bill. But that requirement is not defined. And that might be because this requirement simply doesn't make sense. Law enforcement agencies don't continue to track the lives of their employees after they retire. They do sometimes declare that law enforcement officers retired in good standing, but that's a determination made at the time that they're actually retiring. It gets us right back to the same issue. What happens after they retire? Background checks are the gold standard for ensuring someone is allowed to lawfully purchase a firearm. This issue could easily be solved by adding the background check provision back into this bill. And a background check would not be burdensome to officers and retired officers, since the vast majority of background checks are completed within minutes. Our colleagues have continued to dig in their heels on a bill that creates an unacceptable loophole in the background check system, a loophole that could put a gun in the hands of a person who is not legally allowed to have one. And even one instance of this could have deadly consequences. This bill could be bipartisan, as it was in the 117th Congress when it was led by my friend, my former colleague, and former Orlando Police Chief Val Demings. Former Congresswoman Demings frequently reached across the aisle. Over 40% of her bills had bipartisan co-sponsorship in her last term in office. We should be following her example to lead with bipartisanship when possible and strive to work together to help improve our communities. This bill is being marked up in advance of Police Week, a time when we used to be able to work together to pass bills with broad bipartisan support. We should be looking for ways to help law enforcement make our communities safer in places that they live, and ways to help law enforcement stay safe as they do their work. We should be investing in tools to help them be effective and directing resources towards solving violent crime. As ranking member of the Subcommittee on Crime, I hope we can still find a better way to do this. My door is always open to my colleagues on the other side, always open to those who want to work together in good faith. I must oppose this legislation for creating needless risks that could have deadly consequences. I call on my Republican colleagues, and I really mean this. I call on you to work with us on bipartisan bills that would give law enforcement the tools that they need instead of opening up loopholes in our background check system, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? The gentleman from New York, and then we'll come to.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report. Gentleman from California reserves a point of order.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2255 offered.
Without objection, the bill be considered as read. The gentleman from New York is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment does a simple but very important restriction on the ability of a retired officer to purchase a retired firearm from his or her agency. And that is to limit the number of firearms purchased by such officer to one. This bill does nothing to prohibit an officer from purchasing any number of firearms from his agency or her agency,
and then with the possibility of distributing them or selling them to others outside of the normal background check requirements for federal firearms sellers. By limiting the number of firearms to one, I believe that we are getting to the true purpose of this bill, which is to allow retired officers to maintain a firearm that they used, if in good standing, while in service. And if the rationale is, as my friend from South Carolina says, which is to simply allow retired officers to continue to hold and possess their own firearm from while they were in service, there should be no objection to limiting the number of firearms to one. I think this amendment is eminently reasonable, gets to the heart of what the bill drafter is trying to get to, and very importantly, limits the possibility of further distribution of firearms without adhering to the guidelines that protect selling firearms and putting them in the hands of those who should not have them. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just in response to the amendment, I oppose it, and here's the reason why. I mean, you've got a federal law enforcement officer in good standing, and we are continuing to perpetuate the existing scheme, which costs taxpayers $8 million a year, that somehow that they're limited if they are assigned a pistol, a long gun, and a shotgun, somehow they're limited by this amendment to just have one of those. Well, it doesn't make any sense to me that we're continuing to perpetuate the existing scheme that costs the taxpayers $8 million a year. This is common sense, it is easy to do, and this amendment absolutely limits the intent of the bill and continues to cost the taxpayers needless dollars.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
I yield back.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
The gentleman is yielded back. Is there further discussion on the amendment?
I seek recognition.
Gentleman is recognized.
Sure. I know the sponsor of the bill just left, probably just a potty break, but I'm just curious. He was not okay with one. What about two or three? He gave the example of three. What if we set a limit at three? Would he be okay if the amendment was three? I'm just curious. You know, maybe we could try to make it bipartisan. I mean, what we're trying to do is we're just trying to not have an open-ended thing. And so he gave an example of three. If three is the number, I'll support that amendment. If that's okay. Does anyone on the side want to like have a conversation, or how about the gentleman who brought the amendment?
Well, I appreciate the distinguished gentleman from Florida's point, which I think goes even further. It is one thing for an on-duty officer to maintain a pistol, a long gun, and a shotgun while in the service of duty. It is altogether another thing for a retired officer who would not be on any mission or any obligation to act to protect anyone other than him or herself to have three guns. What is the point? If this is just so that a retired officer can defend him or herself with a gun that he or she used while in service, why on earth would that officer need more than one gun?
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
Yes, of course.
Is there anything in their legislation that would prevent a retired officer from reselling a gun or guns that they are able to purchase at the new salvage value?
There is nothing in this bill that prohibits the distribution or selling of a firearm obtained by a retired officer from the agency where he or she serves.
So you're telling me that a retired officer, if we don't accept your amendment, could purchase 5 guns or 10 guns or 20 guns at the new government discounted price and then resell them at a fair market value price? In other words, they could make money on it through private sales. Is that right?
Absolutely, and even worse, it wouldn't be detected. It wouldn't go through, it wouldn't be required to go through the normal background check procedures, the tracing through the ATF to ensure that that sold gun does not fall into hands of someone who would otherwise be prohibited from owning a gun.
If I could ask one other question of the distinguished gentleman from New York, it seems to me that we either have to adopt your amendment, and this is certainly consistent with the way that Ms. Demings first brought this up, that it was the idea that the officer would be able to purchase their gun when they leave the service, and that was clearly her intent. Either we've got to adopt that, or if it's going to be unlimited, that they can purchase at salvage value whatever guns from the police force arsenal are being retired, then we've got to say that these guns cannot be resold on the private market, because otherwise we're opening up a gaping new loophole in terms of guns entering into the market. And of course, it's that kind of permissiveness and laxness that has given America a rate of homicide, violence, and death that is just unknown in the rest of the advanced countries of the world.
Will the gentleman yield?
I will yield in 1 second. I just want to respond. I actually considered an amendment to that effect as well. The problem, of course, is it is very hard to enforce, and it would certainly cost more than $8 million to do so. I'm kind of surprised that a justification for this bill is that we spend $8 million, not billion, not trillion, but $8 million, which is pennies compared to our budget, that is some sort of motivation for why we should allow the sale of these firearms to the officers. And again, there's no good rationale why it should be more than one. I yield to the chairman.
I just wanted to point out that this bill is self-limiting. It's limited to firearms that have been issued to the law enforcement officer. It's not open-ended.
So just reclaiming my time, which kind of went around. So what you're proffering is that there is a limitation in the bill, that there is a limitation on how many weapons.
The bill only applies to firearms issued to the law enforcement officer.
That could be any number.
Gentleman's time has expired. Further discussion, Mr. Massey.
You know, on the other side of the aisle, there's an assertion or an assumption that's completely wrong about this bill that I heard expressed. They said this is so that police officers can protect themselves after they retire. No, they have decades of learning, of discernment, of training, of experience. And the incentive here is if you let them have their firearm, that they will continue to do that for the public on their own dime. They'll carry these firearms. They've been trained to recognize situations. And it's a way to get a safer environment for the public, and all you're doing is making it easier for the law enforcement officer to carry their firearm into retirement. So I reject the assertion that we're just doing this so that they can be safe for themselves.
Will the gentleman yield?
Sure.
So in the language, and we're trying to actually work this out. It doesn't say their firearm or the firearms issued to them. It says a firearm. And so that's where the discussion is going. If the intent of the language is that they can only purchase the firearms issued to them, then I think some of the concern that we have would go away. So if we just seeking that clarification. Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I'll yield.
I mean, the language is quite clear, that the Administrative General Services shall establish a program under which a federal law enforcement officer may purchase a retired firearm from the federal agency that issued the firearm to such officer.
Wait, would the gentleman yield?
Well, Mr. Massey's time. Yield back, Mr. Massey.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear here in the legislation. It says, may purchase a retired firearm from the federal agency that issued the firearm to such officer.
Will the gentleman yield just for a question?
In just a second, but will you admit that what was just said is wrong, that it doesn't say anywhere in the language that it's one that was issued to this officer?
Wait,
Yes, I will.
Now-
I would
no,
like to correct that. All that does is it clarifies and specifies which agency the officer may purchase a retired firearm from. It does not say that it must be a retired firearm belonging to such officer. So maybe
Reclaiming my time,
reclaiming
reclaiming my time, I want to point out here, and I appreciate you clarifying what you said before. A retired firearm from the federal agency that issued the firearm to such officer. So the firearm is referring to the one that the officer was issued.
It's modifying the federal agency. It's not modifying the gun. The gun is a retired firearm. And then it's specifying that the retired firearm is from the federal agency that issued the firearm to such officer.
So the firearm, I think, is clear here, but would the gentleman vote for this bill if we change A to the in the first instance of retired firearm?
I would certainly be inclined to vote for this bill if it were to specify that a retired officer may purchase a firearm that had been distributed or had been issued to that officer. So in other words, it would have to change more than A to the, but yes, if your point is to say that only firearms that belong to that officer can be sold to that officer in retirement, then yes.
I'll offer the amendment if the gentleman will vote for it and vote for the bill, the underlying bill.
Yeah?
All right.
Well, yeah. Will the gentleman yield?
Yeah, I have 36 seconds.
Okay. So we're achieving some clarity here. Right now, it is written in such a way as to say that as long as the gun comes from the same agency that issued the...
No, it's not.
It says the officer may purchase a retired firearm from the federal agency that issued the firearm to such officer. Right?
The firearm.
It has to be issued to it.
But
It has to be issued to him, and it's the firearm.
No, but it's just saying that it's the federal agency that issued the firearm.
I make you
It
the
says
same
a-
offer.
Okay. Well, in any event, if we can agree to the point, the substance of it, I would support this if we include the background check.
No, now you're moving the goalpost.
No, I'm restoring what we passed as a committee before.
It's kind of becoming obvious that you're refusing to diagram the sentence, and you're just being dilatory.
The gentleman's time has expired. Is there further discussion on the amendment by Mr. Goldman? Mr. Chairman. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, oftentimes when a bad actor, law enforcement officer, even from a federal agency, does something that violates the rules of the agency, it may even violate the law. It may be related to excessive use of force. But such officer is allowed to resign in lieu of termination. And in those kinds of situations where a bad police officer, a bad actor, is being pressured to resign or be fired and chooses to resign, that officer would probably be in good standing with the federal agency that employed that officer. And then that officer would be in a position to purchase at salvage value whatever firearm was either issued to him or her, as my colleagues are talking about, or whatever firearm, whether or not it was issued or not to that particular officer. But the point is that you have bad actors who would be able to purchase firearms under this legislation, firearms that were either issued to them or may not have been issued to them. That is creating a danger to society when you are unleashing these powerful weapons into the hands of someone who's being offered the opportunity to step down in lieu of termination. Because of that glaring loophole in this legislation, I would be opposed to it. And with that, I will yield back.
Gentleman yields back? Does the gentleman yields back? Yeah. Further discussion on the amendment by Mr. Goldman, Mr. Van Drew.
Thank you, Chairman. Just quickly, I think maybe we're looking into this, how do I say this? I think we're overreading what's going on here, overanalyzing. A police officer retires. When he retires, he wants to keep the gun that was issued to him over the years that he carried as a police officer. He would be able to buy that gun, and I don't think there's anything wrong with this, at the salvage value. The least we can do for somebody that's dedicated their life to serving, to protect others, is that we're still charging them, but we charge the salvage value. If you're trying to indicate, which I don't see here in the legislation, that years later the police officer could buy other firearms from an agency, then I think that a background check would be appropriate. I'm going to vote for this legislation either way. I don't like to vote for amendments on the fly because usually they don't work out. They have to be thought through. And I'm sure the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Fry, if he feels it's necessary, along with the chairman, would move forward if any amendments need to be done as we go to the floor. But nevertheless, we're overthinking this. A cop retires, the gun that he used, he wants to buy it. He buys it, yes, at a discount, because it's a used gun, by the way, and it's the least we can do that he buys it at the salvage value, and it's the gun that was issued to him. So that's how I'm seeing this legislation. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Is there further discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the adoption of the amendment by Mr. Goldman. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no.
No.
The noes appear to have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Can we have a recorded vote on that, Mr. Chairman?
Recorded vote's been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan.
Okay.
Mr. Issa. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock.
No.
Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Massey.
No.
Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Klein. No. Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Gooden. Mr. Gooden votes no. Mr. Van Drew. No. Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Nels. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. Kiley. Mr. Kiley votes no. Ms. Hageman. Ms. Lee. Mr. Hunt. Mr. Fry. Mr. Fry. Mr. Fry votes no. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman votes no. Mr. Knott. Mr. Knott votes no. Mr. Harris. Mr. Harris votes no. Mr. Onder. Mr. Onder votes no. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Gill. Mr. Baumgartner. Mr. Baumgartner votes no. Mr. Raskin.
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Mr. Nadler. Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Swalwell. Mr. Liu. Ms. Jayapal. Mr. Correa. Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Mr. Neguse. Ms. McBath. Ms. McBath votes aye. Ms. Ross. Ms. Ballant. Mr. Garcia. Mr. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Kamlager-Dove. Ms. Kamlager-Dove votes aye. Mr. Moskowitz. Mr. Goldman.
Aye.
Mr. Goldman votes aye. Ms. Crockett. Ms. Crockett votes yes.
How am I recorded?
Mr. Issa, you're not recorded. Mr. Issa votes no. Ms. Ballant, you are not recorded. Ms. Ballant votes aye.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 10 ayes and 15 noes.
Vote being 10 in the affirmative, 15 in the negative, the amendment is not agreed to. Is there further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Ms. Scanlon.
I just wanted, with respect to the underlying bill, I just wanted to associate myself with the remarks of the ranking member and with Ms. McBath. I think they very eloquently stated the base points, but above all, we need to close loopholes, not create new loopholes. When I talk to our law enforcement officers in my district at every level, they say they need help to make sure that we keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. So I can't support the law because it does create a new loophole. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment in nature of substitute? Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report. Gentleman from Arizona reserves a point of order.
Substitute for the amendment and the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2255, offered by Mr. Raskin of Maryland.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you kindly, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would substitute for this unnecessarily politicized bill text the language that was voice voted unanimously, as far as I could tell, out of this committee without objection during the 118th Congress. The bill before us would allow law enforcement officers and retired officers to buy an assault weapon, a hand grenade, or a National Firearms Act weapon from the government at a sharp discount without a background check, opening up a significant and dangerous new loophole in the background check system. This is despite the fact that 6 in 10 Americans support stricter common sense gun safety laws to reduce the horrific gun-related death toll that we see all around us in the cities, in rural areas, and suburban areas. My amendment returns us to the version of the bill that was previously reported out of this committee and would likely yield substantial bipartisan support on the floor. It would ensure that only active law enforcement officers can purchase retired service weapons, significantly reducing the risk that a prohibited purchaser would be able to buy a gun as a result of our legislation. It would also limit purchases of retired weapons to handguns and ensure that taxpayers are not subsidizing the private purchase of weapons by requiring an officer to pay the fair market value of the weapon. I urge our colleagues to take yes for an answer to restore the bipartisan common ground legislation we all approved of last Congress, and which will achieve perhaps unanimous support on the House floor. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there discussion on the amendment by the ranking member? Mr. Knott.
Mr. Raskin, may I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
What's the purpose from limiting this just to a handgun if an officer or an agent is familiar with AR-15s or whatever the shotgun, long guns, whatever they may be? What would be the purpose that you're seeking to achieve in precluding them from being able to take those weapons home?
Well, the purpose is consistent with what I understood to be the original motivation behind the legislation that Congresswoman Demings had introduced. I was here on the committee, and she talked about giving officers the right to purchase a gun that they had used for self-defense. And as the Supreme Court determined in Heller versus District of Columbia, that's a core Second Amendment right to be able to carry a handgun for self-defense.
But may I? Mr. Raskin, in regards to the threat to the threat to the public, handguns are used in far more crimes. They're responsible for far more deaths than long guns, whether it's shotguns or AR-15s. Does that alleviate any concerns you have about allowing federal agents or officers to take those guns with them in the same spirit as this language?
Well, we could check with Mr. Fry about it because this was his original legislation, and it is true that the toll of handgun violence is extraordinary because we don't have a universal violent criminal background check and we have so many loopholes. So I'm not certain I know the answer to that question. I think we could check with Mr. Fry, who originally introduced it this way. It struck us as a reasonable, common sense, bipartisan compromise consistent with the original bill that had been introduced by Congresswoman Demings.
Thank you for the discussion, sir. And I'll just state for the record, Mr. Chair, that having worked with law enforcement at every level, their training, their handling, their abilities with those firearms, I've never seen a law enforcement officer act irresponsibly in allowing them to take home their service weapons. In the spirit of this law, I fully support. I yield back.
Gentleman from North Carolina yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on.
I'm sorry.
Mr. Massey.
I think there's a fair point here that Mr. Raskin has. I'm not going to vote for his amendment, but because our friend over here has a great point that long guns and shotguns can be just as effective or more effective in certain circumstances for defending a person or the public. And so we shouldn't exclude those. But the point I believe you do have is that there may be some NFA, National Firearms Act, weapons that would be allowed under this that might not be necessary for self-defense, like hand grenades. So I plan to offer an amendment that takes care of that issue here after your amendment is voted on.
Jenny is back. Is there further discussion?
In response to Mr. Goldman's concern.
Does Mr. Massey yield to Mr. Raskin?
I'll yield to Mr. Raskin.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that very much, Mr. Massey. Look, the legislation that we adopted by voice vote last Congress was a compromise which articulated the basic common sense understanding that an officer could essentially take a gun with them, purchasing it at fair market value, in order to have self-defense. And then when we add in everything else, we do get hand grenades and, semi-automatic assault weapons and all of these things, which raises different kinds of issues and strays far from the core meaning of a self-defense weapon. And so that's why I think this, again, would pass overwhelmingly, if not unanimously, in the House if we just went back to that original compromise. But it has been shot through with a bunch of loopholes that are unnecessary. So, I would view your suggestion as a second best solution to just going back to the compromise that we originally had. Thank you.
Mr. Massey.
Reclaiming my time, I think we can make legislation better. We don't have to use the same stuff we had last year if we found a better way to do it. So, by the way, I think your amendment has something about the price of the gun that the officer has to pay. And again, the motivation, I believe, behind this bill is if you encourage or make it easier for retired police officers who have decades, in many cases, of experience of defending the public, make it easier for them to carry their service weapon when they retire, that they could provide that help. And by the way, retired police officers are often used in school settings to, as the security. And so, because they recognize there's training there, there's experience, and there's decades of discernment. So I think charging more for the firearm doesn't help, and that's one reason that I can't vote for yours, but I will try to address the concern that you have about NFA weapons with my amendment that I will offer next.
Would the gentleman yield?
And I'll yield to Mr. Vandrew.
I just want to associate myself with the remarks by Mr. Knott and Mr. Massey. I think is one point about the hand grenade or something that wouldn't be appropriate is a good point. And his second point, why are we trying to squeeze police officers and say they have to pay more than the salvage value? Again, they serve their long career. They put their lives on the line. We certainly can do this tiny, tiny little thing for them. However, I think the legislation could be tightened up, and I think that would be an appropriate amendment. I would support that amendment, Mr. Massey, just so you know. I think it's a good idea, and I yield back to you.
Mr. Massey.
And I yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment by Mr. Raskin? Does Ms. McBath seek recognition?
Yes, I do, Mr. Chair. And having good conversation with Mr. Goldman and also with Ranking Member, I would be willing to accept the amendments. I would be willing to have Raskin's amendment. I think the further discussion that we've had is amenable, and it does still continues to close some loopholes. I yield back.
Further discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, the questions on the adoption of the amendment by Mr. Raskin. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no.
No.
The noes appear to have it.
Could we have a recorded vote?
A recorded vote's been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan? Mr. Isa? Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock?
Nope.
Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Massey?
No.
Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Gooden? Mr. Gooden votes no. Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Nels? Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. Kiley? Ms. Hageman? Ms. Lee? Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Fry votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Mr. Knott?
No.
Mr. Knott votes no. Mr. Harris? Mr. Harris votes no. Mr. Onder? Mr. Onder votes no. Mr. Schmidt? Mr. Gill? Mr. Baumgartner? Mr. Baumgartner votes no. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Mr. Nadler? Aye. Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Mr. Neguse? Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes aye. Ms. Ross? Ms. Ballant? Ms. Ballant votes aye. Mr. Garcia? Mr. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Kamlager-Dove? Ms. Kamlager-Dove votes aye. Mr. Moskowitz? Mr. Moskowitz votes yes. Mr. Goldman? Mr. Goldman votes aye. Ms. Crockett? Ms. Crockett votes aye. Mr. Swalwell, you're not recorded. Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Roy, you're not recorded. Mr. Roy votes nay. Mr. Fitzgerald votes no.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 11 ayes and 14 noes.
Vote being 11 in the affirmative and 14 in the negative, the amendment is not agreed to. Is there further discussion on?
Ms.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there further discussion on the amendment, the nature of a substitute? Mr. Massey.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2255 offered by Mr. Massey and Mr. Goldman. Page 1, line 10, after quote firearm.
Without objection, the amendment be considered as read. The chair recognizes Mr. Massey.
In the spirit of bipartisanship, I want to recognize that Mr. Goldman and Mr. Raskin have identified ways to improve this bill. And so I want to offer an amendment to address their concerns. It makes two changes to the bill. Page 1, line 10, after firearm in the first instance, where it's mentioned, add, quote, issued to the federal law enforcement officer, unquote. This takes away any ambiguity that might exist about whether the federal law enforcement officer is going to receive the weapon that was issued to that officer, or whether it would be any weapon in the, obviously, after this, it's obvious it doesn't include any weapon in the inventory of that agency. The second change that this amendment will affect on the bill is instead of just excluding machine guns, it will exclude all weapons and firearms covered by the National Firearms Act of 1934. So that would cover, for instance, the hand grenades that they mentioned, or other destructive devices, such as a sawed-off shotgun. Those would be excluded from the transfer to the law enforcement officer if it's and of course, machine guns are also included in that exclusion as well. We're keeping that exclusion. So with that, and Mr. Goldman has worked with me on this. We've used his language, and I'm offering this in the spirit of bipartisanship. If Mr. Goldman would like to speak on this, I would yield.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Massey. This certainly makes an improvement to the bill, and I appreciate the fact that we're engaged in meaningful legislative discussion here. We've never had a hearing on this legislation specifically, so I appreciate the fact that the markup is an occasion for us to make some improvements. But and it does, in terms of the things that I've raised, it does take care of not just machine guns, but other, hand grenades, short-railed rifles, sawed-off shotguns, other destructive devices that are regulated by federal law. My problem, my essential problem, though, is a somewhat different one, which is that the retired officers don't need to have a background check before they get whatever guns they're going to get. And that means the person could actually have committed crimes, but we wouldn't know about it because we don't take the 5-minute time period to do a background check on it. And that just doesn't make any sense. I mean, sometimes it takes 2 minutes to do a background check. And so I think there's some confusion about the word retirement and the 6-month period. When I first read it, it seemed like, okay, somebody retires and then within 6 months, they can purchase the gun, the rifle, what have you. But it's actually within 6 months of the retirement of the gun, not the retirement of the person. So it could be 5 years later or 8 years later or 10 years later. That's a lot of time in which a person conceivably could have crossed lines with the law. And so all we're saying is
reclaiming my time.
Yeah.
I hope we've ameliorated that concern somewhat by clarifying that it is the firearm that's being retired and the officer that's retired, and they are paired up. So it's not a carte blanche, open pass to go buy anything in the inventory, and it's reasonable to expect they're going to retire at the same time, the gun and the officer.
Yeah, but you're much more of a gun guy than I am, Mr. Massey. So I don't know what the average length or endurance of a gun is or a firearm is. And I just don't see the problem with restoring the background check. If we take your very fine amendment and we add it to a background check, I think we're close to the common sense, common ground legislation we're looking for.
My problem with that is this is an officer probably likely has 2 or 3 decades of experience, and there are 100,000 false denials in the background check system. And it would add, I think, insult to injury to tell an officer, hey, your name is similar to somebody else. I'm sorry you can't have the gun you've carried for 3 decades. Yeah.
Would the ranking member yield?
And they would have to be in good standing when they retire. It's not like
Mr.
somebody
Massey
was
controls the time.
fired. I'll yield to Mr. Nadler.
Well, wouldn't a further amendment that made clear that you're talking about the retirement of the officer, 6 months within the retirement of the officer, rather than the retirement of the gun, take care of the problem?
This seems like we're in the weeds here. This is a common sense bill, and I think to complicate it with that. I'm bending over here quite a bit.
Well, if the
Gentleman's time
gentleman would
is
further
expired.
yield,
Mr. Nadler.
just clarifying that we mean retirement of the officer doesn't impose any burden and would and makes clear that
what I've just been informed, the way the bill's written, if the firearm is retired, the officer can obtain it, even if the officer is not retired.
Yeah, but the problem with
What
that,
is the problem
that's
with
exactly the right. That's exactly correct. The problem with that is that the firearm may not be retired till 10 years after the officer retires, and maybe the officer, when he retired, is a perfectly fine guy, but in the interim 10 years he committed crimes, and you wouldn't know that. So if we simply said 6 months from the time of the retirement of the gun, then well, you wouldn't have the problem.
Reclaiming my time, which doesn't really
Mr.
exist
Nadler
right now.
controls the time.
Whose time is it? Mr. Nadler. Would you yield?
Okay.
They're not going to have a special safe for guns that officers might want 10 years later. The gun is either going to get reassigned to another officer, i.e. not retired, or it's going to get destroyed or disposed of some other way. They're not going to keep us.
Reclaiming my time.
It's not Dick's Sporting Goods.
Hopefully. Reclaiming my time, the Republicans had a common sense bill on the floor, and it was filled on the floor with loopholes. This amendment would simply restore it to the bill that the Republicans first. The Raskin amendment would simply restore it to the same bill that the Republicans offered on the floor last year. And we should have adopted it. And then we could. And if this amendment were adopted, we could support it now.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will.
But thank you. Look, here's where I think we are on this, and the public's getting the inside view of the sausage factory here. We had a bipartisan bill that the vast majority of people supported on the floor. Then it was revised with a whole bunch of new amendments that significantly broadened the bill and added loopholes that you have candidly acknowledged, Mr. Massey, with your amendment to take care of one of the problems. To my mind, it doesn't take care of the essential problem, which is that we don't want people being able to purchase firearms, especially from the police, without a background check. And the vast majority of background checks take place in 2 or 3 minutes. Right, and I know you have a different perspective on that. You've got some cases where people have been caught up in that, and maybe there are some false positives or false negatives or what have you. But in the vast majority of the cases, it works, and most Americans are willing to pay that price for the purposes of public safety. If we can come together on that, in addition to the amendment you have, then we're back to the common sense, common ground gun safety legislation that allows for this to happen that we agreed to in the last Congress. So thank you for yielding, Mr. Nadler.
I would hope that Mr. Massey could accept this further amendment or the common sense bill that the Republicans offered last year, which we were going to support until it was filled with extraneous loopholes, and it would enable officers to who presumably had a background check while they were officers to take their to possess their guns, and if someone had waited years to try to do this after they retired, it would require a background check, which should be the case because who knows, the former police officer may in the ensuing years have committed crimes. And we ought to know that before we allow the possession of the firearm. So I support Mr. Raskin's amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. So further discussion on the amendment by Mr. Massey, gentleman from Wisconsin.
Move to strike last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
I yield my time to Mr. Massey.
I think the basic problem, there's two basic problems here. Is what you're saying is you don't trust police officers, retired police officers, a federal police officer, or the federal agency who may be giving them the firearm. They have to be in good standing to receive it. Here's my problem. Over 99% of NICS denials are false denials. Now, I know you assign value to the 1%, and you say that's better than that. It's worth stopping the 1% that NICS may be accurate for, which is actually probably smaller than that, and burdening the public with the 99% false denials. To me, we shouldn't put a federal law enforcement officer in that kind of jeopardy. And the other problem that I have here, or that I'm seeing, this is not exactly the same bill. This is a better bill. And the problems that have been identified, I'm addressing with this amendment. And I believe there will be some on your aisle who recognize that. I would hope you would vote for my amendment, those on the other side of the aisle. But, you know, I worked with Mr. Goldman on this.
Would the gentleman yield for a moment?
And I'm sure you all have worked on this with people on this side. You'll find we've got reasonable people, and some days we've got unreasonable people. But what I've found is somebody who's reasonable over there who wants to work with us and improve the bill. So that's what I've done.
The gentleman yield for a moment?
It's Mr. Fitzgerald's time.
Yield to Mr. Nadler.
Yes, I just want to point out that Mr. Massey, I think, was mistaken. 99% of denials are correct. 1% are incorrect, not the other way around.
Can I
yield back?
Well,
Reclaiming. Yield to Mr. Massey.
okay, for the year that we have data, there were 12 prosecutions, federal prosecutions, and 110,000 denials. So and by the way, if you are denied, if you're rightfully denied, that means you tried to illegally purchase a firearm. You were a prohibited person who lied on the form, or and those should have been, if it was 99% accurate denials, there should be tens of thousands of prosecutions from those denials. But instead, there are 12 in a given year. And in the best year, no more than 24.
Will the gentleman yield?
I would yield.
Well, but I believe there is a scienter requirement. There's a specific intent requirement. I don't know why they're not bringing all of those cases, but it doesn't follow. It seems to me to be a non sequitur to say because they didn't bring prosecutions in all of those cases, those people were actually qualified to get
Reclaiming. Yield to Mr.
Okay,
Nadler.
so here's the specter of what happens when you're denied. You can appeal, and if that appeal doesn't work, then you have to hire a lawyer. And now you're spending money, which defeats the whole purpose of this thing. And by the way, of all the denials ever, I suspect never was one a retired police officer. I mean, I don't know that, but common sense would tell you that. So it defeats the purpose if you're going to put the officer in jeopardy of having to hire a lawyer to get past the second denial of the background check if it's not overturned on the first appeal. And the purpose of this is we trust law enforcement officers. We've trusted them with our lives. They're in charge of public safety. They've spent decades doing it. It's the ultimate background check. You have put your life on the line. You have carried this firearm loaded for 365 days a year in many cases for 30 years, 20 years. That is the ultimate background check. We don't need to put them through some system that's hobbled with all sorts of inaccuracies. And let's just keep the intent of the bill. Let's clarify the objections that you had. I think that Mr. Goldman and I think you shared these objections, Mr. Raskin, that I'm addressing in this amendment. We're fixing two, not one of the objections. And let's get this bill done.
Gentleman
back to the
yields
gentleman
back.
from
Is there
Wisconsin.
further discussion on the amendment by Mr. Massey, Mr. Goldman?
First, I just want to thank my colleague, Mr. Massey, for engaging in this good faith effort to reach a resolution. I will say that as part of my discussions, I was under the wrong impression, that the officer would have to purchase the retired firearm within 6 months of the officer's retirement. If that were the case, I do not worry nearly as much about a background check, since the officer would be in good standing upon retirement and then would purchase the firearm within 6 months. I think it is very unlikely that 10 years, there are many officers who purchase their own firearm 10 years later. But I do think that the open-ended time frame for an officer to purchase the firearm is potentially problematic. And I agree with Mr. Massey that it is the ultimate background check, which is why I have no problem if the officer has 6 months to purchase the firearm. But I think that we run into potential issues, and I would hate for an officer 10 years out, a retired officer, to have, to be able to purchase a firearm that another civilian would not have been able to purchase, and God forbid, do something terrible with the firearm. I am willing to continue to work with Mr. Massey if 6 months is not reasonable, given that firearms may be retired after the officer is retired. I understand there may be additional issues, but if there were some guardrails on the length of time, and I'm not requiring 6 months, but if there were some guardrails on the length of time so that it wasn't open-ended, I would certainly support this amendment, and I would support the underlying bill as well.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, of course.
I think you're correct. It's highly unlikely that 10 years later that the gun is still going to be in inventory and that the officer's still going to be interested in it. He's going to wake up one day and say, oh, that Colt I had? Boy, I miss it. It's been 10 years since I held that baby. And it belongs in my safe or on my side. I just don't see that happening. I think you don't either. Ultimately, what I need to know is if you're going to vote for the bill, if this amendment passes. I thought we had an agreement. I was working in good faith. I've modified this thing to ameliorate your first concern, and then you said you had another concern which you brought to me. And so I sent everybody back there to change the amendment again for your second concern. And so I'm all out of concerns. If you can't, after I've addressed, the two concerns that you've had, if you can't vote for the bill with this amendment as part of it, I will withdraw the amendment, and we'll have the partisan vote that that it seemed we were doomed to on the way in, that I was trying to avoid.
And I reclaim my time. And you are correct. You did address the two concerns I raised. As I said, I was under the misimpression that there was a time limit on the amount of time that an officer can do this. I am not prepared in this exact moment to tell you whether I will vote on the underlying bill. I understand that that is a concern of yours. Given the fact that we haven't had hearings on this bill and that we are doing this in real time, I would ask the chairman to table this amendment and this bill until later, so that we can have some further internal and bipartisan discussion.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I yield.
Just to add to one more concern, Mr. Massey, first of all, I hope you don't withdraw your amendment. I thought you were introducing the amendment in order to improve the bill, which it does, so people aren't getting hand grenades and other, dangerous, destructive devices. But in any event, if you look at page 2 on the amendment in the nature of substitute, I'm just confused about this because it begins with the limitations. A federal law enforcement officer may purchase a retired firearm under subsection A if the purchase is made during the 6-month period beginning on the date the firearm was so retired. And then, at the top of page 2, with respect to such purchase, the officer is in good standing with the federal agency that employs or employed such officer. What does it mean for a retired officer to be in good standing with the federal agency? And that's why what I'm insisting on is the background check. I just don't know what that means.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair claims time and yields to Mr. Massey.
Mr. Chairman, I thought I was working in good faith with the other side of the aisle. There was a legitimate concern, some ambiguity in the language. I committed to fixing that, and I thought I had at least one person who said, if I fix that, they would vote for it, but then he had another concern, and he said, okay, well, I've got this other concern. I need it fixed too, and then I'll vote for it. And I fixed the other concern, and we had an agreement. This isn't a backroom deal. This is all played out here in front of the public. You can watch us communicating with each other. And since the agreement is now broken, I regrettably am going to withdraw the amendment, and this will diminish my appetite for trying to work with the other side of the aisle in good faith, because
will the gentleman yield?
It has not worked out. It's Mr. McClintock's time.
Will
Yep, I yield back to Mr. McClintock.
I'll yield.
Thank you. I understand your frustration, Mr. Massey. I want to be very clear that I was also engaging very much in good faith. As I said to you, and I take responsibility for this, I thought the time frame of 6 months was the retired officer, not the retired firearm. That changes the calculus a little bit for me because I did not think that a background check would be necessary within a 6-month time frame. If we are now talking about 10 years or more, I just want to have an opportunity to think about this. You are certainly welcome to withdraw the amendment, but this is not a trivial matter, and I think that given that this is playing out in real time, we ought to take a few minutes to consider it, speak to some experts, and make sure that I don't have another misimpression about what we're doing here. But I do just want to emphasize, in response to your insinuation that I was not acting in good faith, that I very much was, and just simply was under a misimpression on the parameters that are in the bill already that I thought provided guardrails that it turned out do not. And so,
I'm reclaiming my time and yielding to Mr. Massey.
I withdraw the amendment.
Okay.
And then, so if I understand it, there's no debate at that
The
point.
gentleman begs leave to withdraw the amendment. Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. The question is on the...
So, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Raskin.
But my amendment, the Raskin amendment is newly
Gentleman, suspend for a moment.
Yeah.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Reserve a point of order.
Gentleman reserves a point of order.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R.
Without
22.
objection, the amendment is considered read. Chair recognizes Mr. Raskin for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very kindly. This amendment, formerly known as the Massey Amendment, is now the Raskin Amendment. And it will do two primary things here. First, it will make clear, as I think we all agreed, that the firearm denominated in the legislation is the one that was actually issued to the federal law enforcement officer. And I want to thank Mr. Goldman for raising the issue, and I want to thank Mr. Massey for giving us the language to clarify that it is the firearm issued to the law enforcement officer. And secondly, it makes certain that what can be purchased by the officer, or in the newly expanded version, the retired officer, is a handgun, a pistol, a rifle, but not weapons and firearms covered by the National Firearms Act of 1934. And as the distinguished gentleman from Kentucky candidly acknowledged, we don't want to create this gaping new loophole where people can get a hold of hand grenades, sawed-off shotguns, and other types of firearms that have been regulated for decades in America. So, but I'm sorry that that he and Mr. Goldman fell out of love there briefly. But in any event, this is all about advancing public policy legislation, and we want to make sure we make the improvements that came through in actual legislative discussion. We had no hearing on this legislation, so we're essentially doing an impromptu hearing through the markup, and this will at least make what I think is a potentially very risky bill somewhat better. And I want to thank everybody who was involved in this. And so I recommend that we adopt this unanimously in the committee.
From Kentucky is recognized.
I appreciate what the ranking member is trying to do here, but the amendment was offered with a concomitant promise to vote for this, to have a Democrat on the other side of the aisle vote for the underlying bill if this amendment became incorporated as part of the bill. And that's no longer the case. It's no longer the case. It was a compromise. I apologize to the originator of the bill for trying to amend his bill, which I think actually was fine. And we were going to come to the other side of the aisle here, which I did twice. And so if you want to offer this amendment, that's great. I will not be voting for it because it's half of the bargain. It's the half that I offered without the half that your side offered. So it sounds pretty clever, but it's really not. It's very, I don't want to characterize the motives behind it, but I'll just say that I'm a no. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I just want to make sure I'm following. And it's good that we're having these discussions. The American people want to actually see this, right? And it's okay that sometimes a deal falls apart. But obviously, I think you agreed that there isn't that issue in the bill. And regardless of the vote in here, Mr. Massey, there will be a vote on the floor. And I do think that language that you proposed would achieve the goal you were trying to achieve, which would be making it bipartisan on the floor. Because remember, this bill could still be amended beforehand, right? And so, as it was last time. And so I would ask that you reconsider either your own amendment, if you want your name on it, or the new Raskin amendment. Another thought I had, by the way, while I was sitting here is that, we're talking about an officer being able to buy a gun from the agency that issued it. I mean, the way things are going, you got members that actually want to eliminate the agencies that issued the gun in general. So this could be moot anyway, right? If you eliminate the ATF and you eliminate the FBI, the officer won't be able to buy the gun anyway. So, it may be moot to the point, but...
Will the gentleman yield?
I will.
Thank you kindly. I wanted to respond to the distinguished gentleman from Kentucky. In the first place, there was no deal with the Democratic side. I think there were two discussions taking place.
No, it was with Mr. Goldman.
Okay, so the first one was in discussion with Mr. Goldman about an ambiguity in the language, which both of you recognized. And the ambiguity was whether or not the retired law enforcement officer could purchase any gun from the agency where the person had worked, or just the specific gun. And what you were doing, I understand, was clarifying what everybody understood the intent of the legislation was, which is to give the officer the right to buy the guns that they actually used. So all you were doing there was clarifying what was the commonly understood intent of it. Now, on the other thing, I think, and the record will bear this out, as you said, the whole country is watching this, you said that I had correctly and accurately identified a real problem in the legislation as it was brought to us without a hearing. And that problem is that people could purchase hand grenades and sawed-off shotguns. And you said nobody thinks that that's what we should be doing. So that wasn't a deal. You and I arrived at the same conclusion about the problem with the bill. So basically, everybody has agreed at one point or another in this conversation that this amendment will dramatically improve the legislation. Now, I don't think in a fit of pique towards Mr. Goldman, you should oppose the legislation that you wrote. You wrote this amendment. You were about to oppose the amendment that you wrote in front of the entire country. And I hope it hasn't gotten to be that bad. Thank you for yielding.
Okay, well, let's start. I was mollifying concerns. I think the language was pretty clear, but if there was any doubt in the first instance of whether it was something assigned to the officer or something just randomly in inventory, I think the language was clear. I did tell you I thought the language was clear. I may have pejoratively said you refused to diagram the sentence, and I apologize for that.
I love diagramming sentences,
Yeah,
but I think you diagrammed it well. Yeah.
So the other thing here is, okay, the instance of the grenades. There is some concern there, but the reality is federal officers aren't issued grenades. You don't take the grenade home and keep it in your glove box. Like, these are things that are issued. So even though I knew your example was somewhat ludicrous that a federal officer be issued a grenade, these are not Army officers we're talking about. We're talking about law enforcement officers, okay? So I thought, well, if Raskin thinks they're issued hand grenades to take home in the glove box, let's take care of that concern. But that's not the way it works. And then you're like, this is a free transaction. It's actually not. You may have gained something in this amendment that I didn't mean to give up, or that I didn't want to give up.
Reclaiming my time. What if I put a balanced budget amendment in there, and would I get Mr. Massey's support back?
No, that's a fake fight. I vote against the balanced budget amendment. Because I mean, you could go back and look in the record. I think I voted.
Belongs to the gentleman from Florida. Gentleman from Florida yields to the gentleman from Kentucky.
So anyways, there's also the question of, and I'll tell you one reason I'm not going to vote for the amendment. When you throw all NFA items in there, you may be including suppressors, which are legitimate, they shouldn't be categorized as weapons, but they may be under the NFA Act, and those are typically paired with the firearm. If an officer has carried a firearm with a suppressor on it, then it wouldn't really make sense to divorce those two items, but yet you may have accomplished that in this amendment, in the amendment that I wrote. So it wasn't a free transaction. Something was given up here, and that's why I'll vote against it.
Time has expired.
Given up in exchange for a vote, which is not, has been revoked.
Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
I yield to Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Nadler. I will continue to stand up for the Massey Compromise, even if Mr. Massey will not. And so I urge everybody to vote for this amendment.
And reclaiming my time, I do the same. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
May I be recognized briefly?
The gentleman,
I think so. But
gentlelady is recognized to yield to the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Massey, I thank you because you yielded to me, right? Okay, good. I thank you because right now it seems like we can't work together on anything. And so the fact that you put forth the effort, it matters to me even though I wasn't engaged in this conversation. If you would, for me, just riddle me this. Do you understand that we have fears that say someone could retire as a law enforcement officer today and on tomorrow could go and commit some heinous crime or some crime that would prevent them from being able to walk into a store and buy a firearm? It's the reason that the gun show loophole is a big deal for us. And so do you understand that we understand that anything can happen on any given day? I'm asking. If you don't want to answer, it's okay.
Oh, no, I'd love to answer. If it's a heinous crime, they should be in prison. If it's a notorious crime, the federal agency would know that, and it would be on its face ridiculous to issue that firearm to them. They are now then a prohibited person, okay? So just because they don't undergo a background check doesn't mean you're not breaking the law if you give that person a weapon. You are, in fact, breaking the law. The federal agency would not be issuing a firearm to somebody who's broken the law, or they would be in violation of the law as well, regardless of the background check. Now I yield back to you.
Thank you so much. So one of the things that we used to have to deal with, more so on the state level in Texas, is that someone would get arrested for an offense, whether it's domestic violence or whether it's something that is a felony, but because they had not been found guilty, the judges oftentimes would have to issue an order telling them to give up their firearms, list all their firearms, and it was really difficult to enforce that order because you're relying on a person who's just been incarcerated. And I personally know of a number of cases where someone would say arrested for domestic violence. They then end up getting out. They did not turn in their firearms, and then they go out and they do something like the murder-suicide situation. So I guess my question is more so, what is the problem with a guardrail that you see? And is there another way that we could categorize the guardrail that would be amenable, such as
there is no other law that prevents or precludes the officer from possessing a firearm, so that we could maybe have an enhancement if for some reason that officer, say, did end up catching a case and they caught the case in some other state and law enforcement was unaware. This isn't a background check, so it wouldn't be anything that would prevent them, but it would allow for the potential of an increased penalty if for some reason they should not have been allowed to possess that firearm. Would you be amenable to any language like that? It still would allow them to go, they could still go get the gun.
Gentlelady yields.
I'm just trying,
Yeah,
because you're the only person that I've seen, honestly, since I've been in Congress, that is trying to work. And so I want to work. That's it.
Yeah, I don't think we need to go modify federal statutes that are already clear that say it's a crime if you give a prohibited person a firearm. It's a crime to receive it, it's a crime to give it, and a federal law enforcement agency is not going to be committing crimes. They're just not. If we can't trust a federal law enforcement agency with the discernment to not give out guns to former federal officers who've committed crimes, which is a completely hypothetical situation, then we got bigger problems. And I yield back.
You want the remainder?
Gentlelady.
I yield.
Yield back or yield to the gentleman from New York?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My concern is a little bit different than my colleague from Texas, because I tend to agree that the likelihood of someone committing a heinous crime and then purchasing a firearm from their agency is very low. What I am concerned about, and I would love for my colleague from Kansas to address this, I'm concerned about domestic violence. Domestic violence is something that does not always lead to a conviction, but oftentimes will lead to an order of protection, and in many states prohibits someone from purchasing a gun because of the danger to the domestic partner. And I think I just want to be clear that that is the derivation of my personal concern, that I think the statistics show that there are, as with any sector of the population, a portion of retired federal law enforcement officers who would be prohibited from purchasing guns because of domestic violence incidents. And that may not be known by the agency, but would, I think, be very problematic. And so, just so the record is clear, Mr. Massey, that's where my concern stems from.
Let me guess. If I modify my amendment to address domestic violence, you will vote for this until I offer the amendment, and then at which point you'll have another concern. Then I have to withdraw the amendment.
I tell you right now, if
you
you add domestic violence, I will vote for the amendment and I will vote for the underlying bill.
So, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I've fallen for it twice. I won't do it a third time. I hope the public sees that I've tried to work in good faith here. There's an infinite number of concerns. There are all these scenarios that are being dreamed up on the other side of the aisle, which basically have to imagine that federal agencies are not trustworthy and that former federal officers aren't either.
I reclaim my time.
Back. Yes.
I reclaim my time. I want to be really clear. That's not what I'm saying. I agree with you that if somebody commits a crime and then tries to buy a firearm from an agency, that the agency's not going to allow it. That's not my concern. But there is data that shows that retired officers do engage in domestic violence incidents, which would prohibit them from purchasing firearms if there were a background check. This is not a hypothetical. This is real. There's data on this. And I want to just ground this conversation in the data, but that is my concern. And given that there's no time limit within which a federal officer can purchase a his or her own firearm from the agency, and the fact that an order of protection would not necessarily be known by the agency, that is why that 6-month time limit was originally very important to me when I was under the misimpression that it applied, and that is what my concern is without having a background check. As I said, if you want to address domestic violence, which I think would be the vast majority of circumstances when an officer would otherwise be prohibited from buying a gun in any state, I am happy to support this amendment, and I give you and the American people my word that I will vote for the underlying bill.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
The distinguished gentleman from Kentucky implies that he's somehow like Charlie Brown, and you keep on pulling the football away from him every time he's about to kick a field goal. In fact, we never had a hearing on this bill, so this markup session has become a hearing. But here's the bottom line, Mr. Massey. We had a deal in committee last Congress. It passed by voice vote, unanimously as far as I can tell. Everybody supported it, and then it was tanked on the floor with all of these amendments, which riddled it with loopholes. And now we're discovering what the public safety consequences are of those loopholes, and you did, at least briefly during this hearing, recognize them, and you agreed to change the language, and yet you seem to be more invested in your spat with Mr. Goldman as opposed to advancing public policy here. Let's pass my amendment, which used to be your amendment, which everybody can agree to, and let's make this better legislation. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Is there further discussion on the amendment by Mr. Raskin?
I think I would, somebody.
Does Mr. Knott?
I yield to Mr. Massey.
I would just point out that even Mr. Goldman is not satisfied that your amendment goes far enough at this point.
Reclaiming. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the Raskin amendment, but I would again point out the fact that, law enforcement is a brotherhood. They protect each other. When one has a problem, say alcoholism, or, somebody gets a call from the wife of an officer calling his supervisor saying, my husband just assaulted me. And, or an officer could be undergoing PTSD and experiencing trauma that causes them to act out on the job. And because law enforcement is a brotherhood, the agency allows that officer who's having trouble to resign in lieu of termination. Or that officer could have even more pressing issues like the use of excessive force repeatedly, or maybe even theft of government property, some kind of issue involving the criminal law, but yet the brotherhood, in an effort to protect that officer, one of the brothers, allows that officer to resign in lieu of termination. Well, that officer, when he or she resigns, is in good status with the agency, and under this legislation, they would be able to purchase their firearm. And I don't know why we're treating firearms like, say, police dogs, when you have a police dog that is assigned to you, and you and that dog work together over the years, and then you retire, and you have a relationship with this dog, and you want to take that dog. We all understand that, but how can you have a relationship with a firearm? Apparently some folks do, and that's what gives rise to this legislation. And, because it potentially puts a loving firearm in the hand of someone who is not so loving, I'm going to be voting against this legislation, but I think the amendment makes the legislation a little better, so I'll be supporting the amendment. And with that, along with my condolences to the many officers who are forced to retire with no way of being able to connect with that precious firearm that they have lived with for, 10, 12 years. My condolences to them. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Question occurs on the amendment offered by the ranking member. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Could we have a recorded vote, please?
The sponsor asked for a recorded vote. The clerk call the roll.
Mr. Jordan?
No.
Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Issa? Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Massey?
No.
Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Gooden? Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Nels? Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. Kiley? Ms. Hageman? Ms. Lee? Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Fry votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Mr. Knott? Mr. Knott votes no. Mr. Harris? Mr. Harris votes no. Mr. Onder? Mr. Onder votes no. Mr. Schmidt? Mr. Gill? Mr. Baumgartner? Mr. Baumgartner votes no. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Mr. Nadler? Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Mr. Neguse? Ms. McBath? Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Ballant? Mr. Garcia? Ms. Kamlager-Dove? Mr. Moskowitz? Mr. Moskowitz votes aye. Mr. Goldman? Mr. Goldman votes aye. Ms. Crockett? Ms. Crockett votes aye. Ms. Ballant, you are not recorded. Ms. Ballant votes aye. Mr. Van Drew, you are not recorded. Mr. Van Drew votes no. Ms. Hageman, you are not recorded. Ms. Hageman votes no. Mr. Chairman, there are 9 ayes and 15 noes.
The amendment is not adopted. Question now occurs on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. This will be followed immediately by a vote on reporting the bill. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, as the ayes have it, the amendment in the nature of a substitute is adopted. The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered to be reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views.
We have a recorded vote, Mr. Chairman.
Recorded vote requested by the ranking member. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan?
Yes.
Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Issa? Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Gooden? Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Nels? Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes yes. Mr. Kiley? Ms.
I
Hageman?
think we'll go to Massey's next bill.
Ms. Lee? Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Fry votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Mr. Knott? Mr. Knott votes aye. Mr. Harris? Mr. Harris votes aye. Mr. Onder? Mr. Onder votes aye. Mr. Schmidt? Mr. Gill? Mr. Baumgartner? Mr. Baumgartner votes aye. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Mr. Nadler? Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon votes no. Mr. Neguse? Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes no. Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Ballant? Ms. Ballant votes no. Mr. Garcia? Ms. Kamlager-Dove? Mr. Moskowitz? Mr. Goldman? Mr. Goldman votes no. Ms. Crockett? Ms. Crockett votes no. Mr. Van Drew, you are not recorded. Mr. Van Drew votes yes. Ms. Hageman, you are not recorded. Ms. Hageman votes yes. Mr. Roy, you're not recorded. Mr. Roy votes yes.
Probably. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 14 ayes and 9 noes.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered to be reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the bill will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute, incorporating all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. Pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 2267, the NICS Data Reporting Act, for purposes of markup, and move the committee report it favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R.